This video is going to describe the different types of errors that can be made in a hypothesis test. Now, no matter how hard we try or how much evidence we collect, there's always going to exist the possibility that you make an error in your decision in a hypothesis test. There are two types of errors that we can make. The first type of error is called a type 1 error. A type 1 error occurs whenever the null hypothesis is actually true, but the evidence that we collect from the sampling process tells us to reject the null hypothesis. The second type of error is called a type 2 error. A type 2 error occurs when the null hypothesis is actually false, but the evidence that we've collected tells us to fail to reject the null hypothesis. Here's the difference between the two types of errors. A type 1 error occurs when a highly unlikely event occurs that gives us a small p-value and it leads us to incorrectly reject the null hypothesis. Basically, we got a bad sample and our guess for the population parameter that we're looking at was actually correct. A type 2 error occurs when our guess for the population parameter is wrong, but our sample just didn't pick up enough evidence to reject our incorrect guess. In other words, thinking about the mean, the sample mean just wasn't far enough away from the hypothesized population mean to lead us to reject the null hypothesis, even though our guess for the population mean was wrong. I want to show you 3 examples of how we can determine if we've made the correct decision or not. Let's suppose a scientist wants to test the effects of a cancer-curing drug. Here are his hypotheses. The null hypothesis is that the drug has no effect on curing cancer. His alternative hypothesis is that the drug is effective in curing cancer. Let's suppose that the scientist concludes that the drug is effective and that the drug actually does cure cancer. What type of decision did he make here? Well, the scientist rejected the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is actually true, the drug actually does cure cancer, so the null hypothesis is false. In this case, he rejected the null hypothesis is false, which means that he made the correct decision. Let's work with the same scenario, only this time, suppose the scientist concludes that the drug is effective, but in reality, the drug actually has no effect on curing cancer. What type of decision did he make here? Well, in this case, he rejected the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis. He concluded that the drug is effective in curing cancer. However, the null hypothesis is actually true. The drug actually has no effect in reality. So in this case, his evidence led him to reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative. But the null hypothesis was actually true. This is an example of a type 1 error. We reject a true null hypothesis incorrectly. Finally, let's take a look at a third situation. We have the same scenario, only this time, the scientist concludes that the drug has absolutely no effect on curing cancer. But in reality, this drug does cure cancer. What type of decision did he make in this scenario? Well, here, the scientist failed to reject the null hypothesis. He concluded that the drug was ineffective. In reality, the alternative hypothesis is actually true, meaning that the null hypothesis is false. The drug actually is effective in curing cancer. So in this case, since we failed to reject the null hypothesis, but the alternative hypothesis is actually true, this is an example of a type 2 error.